Senator J.D. Vance leaned into the microphone, a smirk playing on his lips. $100 million, he scoffed, for hurting the feelings of a man in a red coat. A ripple of chuckles spread through the courtroom, cameras flashing in a flurry. What Vance didn't realize, however, was that the man suing him wasn't after money at all. He was about to expose a secret, one buried for over a decade. And once that truth was finally spoken aloud, it wouldn't just damage Vance's career, it would utterly detonate it. The setting was the venerable Royal Courts of Justice, a place unaccustomed to such an unconventional case. Most defamation claims typically involved A-list celebrities or intricate business disputes, not a retired Coldstream guard taking on an American senator. Yet, there it was, clearly listed on the docket that crisp October morning. Corporal Ezra Flint versus Senator James David Vance. Outside, London's autumn had settled in with that particular sharpness that compelled reporters to pull their coats tighter as they waited patiently behind the barriers. American press crews, flown in specifically for this occasion, huddled expectantly. Nobody anticipated more than a simple wounded pride lawsuit from what they saw unfolding. Within the marble halls, the usual grand echoes were muted by a thinner crowd than expected. The space wasn't truly empty, but it was filled with the kind of quiet murmurs that arise when people aren't quite sure what they're witnessing. The courtroom itself felt surprisingly intimate for a proceeding so potentially public. When the court clerk's voice cut through the air, reading the case details aloud, the juxtaposition of those names was almost surreal. On one side, a man most people had never heard of. On the other, a senator whose face routinely graced magazine covers. Ezra Flint stood alone at the claimant's table. At 47, he possessed the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades learning not to move unless absolutely necessary. His ceremonial dress uniform was immaculate, the red tunic pressed to razor-sharp creases, white gloves utterly spotless, and the famous bearskin hat resting carefully on the bench beside him. No barrister, no assistants shuffling papers, just him. The contrast with the opposing side was stark, almost comical. Vance's side of the courtroom resembled a small army. 3 barristers, 2 assistants, and stacks of documents that hinted at preparation for a full-scale war, not merely a hearing about perceived slights. Senator J.D. Vance himself radiated that distinct American confidence, a presence that seemed to fill the room even before he spoke. His Navy suit was flawlessly tailored, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably commanding. As he awaited the start of proceedings, he subtly turned to his lead counsel. "How long do we expect this to take?" he inquired in a stage whisper, a tone audible to half the press gallery. 30 minutes, came the quiet reply. Maybe 45. He's representing himself. No legal training. Should be straightforward. Vance nodded, a satisfied expression settling on his face. When the judge gestured for introductions, he leaned into his microphone, the gesture embodying the effortless authority of a man accustomed to having his voice carry immense weight. Your Honor," Senator J.D. Vance began, leaning into the microphone, his voice calibrated with that practiced political cadence, measured yet conversational. "I'd like to begin by stating clearly that I have tremendous respect for the British people and their institutions. However, this lawsuit," he paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the room, "represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what was clearly intended as light-hearted commentary." The courtroom screens flickered to life as his legal team queued up their prepared evidence. The clip was from 2 weeks earlier. Vance at a podium, speaking to what appeared to be a corporate dinner crowd. "You know, I saw those guards outside Buckingham Palace," his recorded voice echoed, pausing precisely for the chuckles that followed on cue. "I thought, that's a lot of taxpayer money for a bunch of well-dressed lawn ornaments." More laughter erupted in the clip than the punchline. "But hey, at least they're good at standing still. Maybe we should borrow one for Congress." The audience in the recorded clip ate it up. A few people in the actual courtroom seemed to suppress smiles. Flint's expression remained utterly unchanged, not so much as a blink. "With respect to Mr. Flint," Vance continued, after the clip faded, "we live in an era where free speech includes the right to satirical commentary. That's not just American values, that's democratic values." He was hitting his stride now, playing directly to what he clearly perceived as his audience. His confidence was infectious, even within a British courtroom where American political theater didn't usually play well. "And let's be honest here," Vance added, with a slight theatrical tilt of his head toward the press gallery. "Standing guard outside a gate, however ceremonially important, doesn't exactly qualify as battlefield heroics." One of his lawyers leaned forward urgently. "Senator," he whispered, "perhaps we should—" "Fine." Vance cut him off, still speaking into the microphone. "I am simply pointing out that there's a difference between actual military service and, well, performance art." He gestured vaguely toward Flint. "However well executed that performance might be." What nobody in that room understood yet, not even Vance's meticulously prepared legal team, was that Ezra Flint hadn't come to defend his hurt feelings. He had come to reveal something that was never supposed to see daylight in a public courtroom. When the judge turned to him and said, "Mr. Flint, you may respond when ready," the silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was precision. The silence of someone who had been waiting years for exactly this moment and wasn't about to waste a single word of it. Vance seemed to settle back in his chair, one leg crossing over the other with casual authority. He had found his rhythm, and everything about his posture suggested he believed the hardest part was over. "I've been in government long enough to recognize when people take things more seriously than they were intended," Vance said, his voice carrying that particular tone politicians use when they want to sound reasonable while dismissing opposition. "This case, frankly, is about wounded pride, not legitimate grievance." His legal team handed him a slim folder, which he opened with a theatrical precision that suggested this moment had been rehearsed. His lip curved slightly as he selected a particular page. "If it pleases the court, I'd like to submit several public responses to my comments, including this gem from a British columnist who wrote, and I quote, 'Perhaps our royal guards could use a little humor. Their faces have been scaring tourists for centuries.'" A few chuckles rippled through the gallery, not loud, but audible enough to suggest that Vance was reading the room correctly. Corporal Flint remained perfectly still at his table, hands clasped loosely in front of him. His face revealed nothing. No anger, no embarrassment, not even interest in what was being said about him. Vance closed the folder with a satisfied snap. "Look, I don't question Corporal Flint's service record. I'm sure he performed his duties with honor, but the changing of the guard is fundamentally a tourist attraction. It's pageantry. No one seriously believes these men are elite commandos, and my comment about lawn ornaments was obviously satirical in nature." He paused, letting that sink in before delivering what he clearly considered his strongest point. No one was harmed by my words unless we're now legally required to protect people's feelings from mild comedy. The judge's voice cut through Vance's smugness with surgical precision. Mr. Vance, I'll remind you that this is a court of law, not a press conference. Of course, Your Honor, my apologies. However, since you've submitted commentary as evidence, the judge continued, the court will naturally allow for proper rebuttal under oath. Something subtle shifted in the air at those words. Not dramatic, more like the precise moment before a gear clicks into place. Vance adjusted his tie and pressed on. The fundamental issue here is that I wasn't mocking an individual. I was commenting on a ceremonial tradition that, let's be frank, exists more for tourism than for actual security. British taxpayers fund it, tourists photograph it, and if someone's ego gets bruised by gentle ribbing, well, that's unfortunate, but it's not a legal matter. He delivered the last part while looking directly at Flint, clearly expecting some kind of reaction. Perhaps anger, perhaps indignation, maybe just the satisfaction of seeing his target squirm. He got nothing. Not even an acknowledgement that he had spoken. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. In the press gallery, reporters started exchanging glances. This was supposed to be David versus Goliath, but David wasn't even picking up his sling. A few whispered conversations started in the back rows. Is that really all he's got? He's not even fighting back. This'll be over in 10 minutes. But Flint's stillness wasn't defeat. Anyone who had spent time around soldiers would have recognized it as something else entirely, the particular calm that comes before action, not after surrender. When the judge finally said, "Mr. Flint, the floor is yours," he didn't leap up or stride dramatically to the witness stand. He simply rose with the measured precision of someone accustomed to movements being watched and judged. He removed his bearskin hat and placed it carefully on the railing. His footsteps on the marble were quiet, but somehow seemed to echo anyway. As he passed Vance's table, the senator gave him a sideways look that clearly communicated, "Let's see what you've got." Flint climbed the steps to the witness stand, turned to face the room, and spoke his first words of the day. Not a speech, not a declaration, just a single quiet sentence that somehow managed to change everything. "I didn't sue because I was offended. I sued because you told a lie that people believed. No legal jargon, no emotional appeals, just that." And suddenly, Vance's confident smirk faltered. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest that maybe this wasn't going to play out exactly as rehearsed. Because the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. And everyone in that courtroom, including J.D. Vance, was about to discover what 30 years of keeping quiet had been protecting. Ezra Flint settled into the witness chair without fanfare. No counsel beside him, no prepared statements, no stack of exhibits. Just a single folded document resting on the ledge in front of him. And the kind of presence that comes from decades of being observed without truly being seen. "I'd like to make a statement under oath," he said simply. The judge nodded. "Proceed, Corporal Flint." His voice didn't strain to fill the room. It barely needed to travel, yet somehow it reached every corner with perfect clarity. "I wasn't decorated for most of what I did, and I never expected to be. The uniform most people see, the red tunic, the ceremony, they think it's all for show. Maybe some of it is, but not all of it." He looked down briefly at his hands, still wearing the white ceremonial gloves. "Several years ago, during a routine changing of the guard at Windsor, There was a diplomat in the crowd, a foreign consulate visiting unofficially. Her presence wasn't announced to the public. We'd been quietly briefed to expect additional security that day, but most of us weren't told specifics. Vance shifted in his chair, arms still crossed, but his attention was clearly focused now. The casual confidence was still there, but tempered with something that might have been an actual curiosity. I was stationed at the north corner, directly inside of the main archway. Summer day, high tourist volume. Everyone had their phones out, taking pictures, the usual crowd behavior we're trained to monitor. Flint reached for his folded document, but didn't open it yet. I noticed someone, a man in his 40s, wearing what looked like a Ministry of Defense contractor badge. But the design was wrong. 3 years out of date. And he wasn't watching the ceremony like everyone else. He was tracking the diplomat's movement. The courtroom had gone completely still. Even the court reporter seemed to be typing more quietly. I made a judgment call. Broke formation, walked off my assigned position. Not quickly, nothing that would alarm civilians. People probably thought I was correcting someone who'd stepped over the barrier lines. The cameras caught it. I'm sure you can probably find footage online of tourists thinking I was part of the show. He tapped the document once against his knee. But I wasn't performing for anyone. Now the silence felt different. Not anticipatory, but focused. Like a room holding its breath. I didn't radio for backup. Didn't draw any weapon. Just got close enough to intercept. And what I discovered in his bag, his eyes lifted now, scanning the courtroom calmly, was a concealed recording device, detailed floor plans of the diplomatic residence and what our explosives team later identified as components for an improvised incendiary device. A sharp intake of breath came from someone in the gallery. The suspect had been tracking the diplomat's schedule for 3 weeks. He knew her route, her timing, her security detail. What he hadn't planned for was someone breaking protocol to investigate a badge that was 3 years out of date. Flint paused, letting that settle. The incident required immediate containment. It never made news because we were specifically instructed that it couldn't. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Flint, is this testimony corroborated by official sources? He nodded once. It is. He unfolded the paper. This is a declassified communication from the Security Service, released just 2 weeks ago following a formal request made through my Member of Parliament. It confirms the incident, the suspect's intentions, and specifies that my intervention prevented what could have been a significant diplomatic crisis. The court clerk approached and accepted the document. The room watched in complete silence as it changed hands. Would you read the highlighted portion, please? Flint requested. The judge opened the file and cleared her throat. Her voice seemed to carry extra weight as she read. Corporal Ezra Flint's intervention on the 17th of March, 2014, conducted without overt force or public disruption, directly prevented a probable attack on a protected foreign diplomat, averting potential diplomatic incident and reputational damage to the Crown. Actions were carried out with exemplary discretion in accordance with national security protocols. The murmurs that followed were quiet, but immediate. Not dramatic gasps, just the sound of people processing information they hadn't expected. Vance's posture had changed. He was leaning forward now, blinking more frequently than before. Flint let the words settle before continuing. I didn't bring this lawsuit because I needed money or recognition. I brought it because your words, your joke, were used to diminish something we were specifically asked to protect. Without acknowledgement. His voice remained steady, never rising. I served 30 years. I've stood beside the graves of men who earned more medals and served fewer years than I have. I've been present for ceremonies honoring widows, orphans, children, saluting photographs of fathers they'll never see again. I never asked anyone to applaud, but I won't allow you to erase what we actually did. He stood up slowly, the movement deliberate and final. This uniform represented real service during real emergencies, and the public couldn't know because sometimes protection requires silence. Sometimes the most important work looks like nothing at all. Then he stepped down from the witness stand, walked past Vance without a glance, and returned to his seat at the claimant's table. The courtroom didn't react with noise. No applause, no shifting, barely even breathing. And for the first time all day, Senator J.D. Vance sat in complete silence, apparently unable to find his voice. The document remained in the judge's hands, somehow seeming heavier than a single piece of paper should. Her gaze followed Flint as he resumed his position at the claimant's table, still in perfect posture, still radiating that particular calm that comes from saying exactly what needed to be said. You could hear small sounds now that the silence had settled, the faint whir of a camera lens adjusting somewhere in the press gallery, the soft rustle of someone shifting papers. But no one seemed to want to be the first to break the quiet. The younger clerks looked uncomfortable, as if they had accidentally witnessed something too private for a public courtroom. Even the experienced court reporter had slowed her typing, fingers moving more carefully across the keys. J.D. Vance sat hunched slightly forward at the defense table now, his earlier casual confidence replaced by something harder to read. His palms were flat against the wooden surface. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he finally reached for his microphone. "Well," he began, the word hanging in the air like he wasn't sure what should follow it. "If this incident was genuinely significant, I would have expected it to be more widely known." He offered a weak attempt at downplaying the revelation. "It wasn't quite an attack, more like testing the water temperature with a tentative tow." The tension in the room seemed to tighten at his words, not release. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting that classified national security operations should be subject to public relations campaigns, Mr. Vance?" "No, Your Honor, certainly not," he replied quickly, then attempted a thin smile. "I simply mean that if something really happened, and it really mattered as much as suggested, it seems unusual for it to remain secret for so many years." This time Flint did respond, though he didn't turn around or reach for a microphone. His voice carried anyway, quiet, but unmistakably clear. "The men I served with didn't survive on public approval. They survived on trust." That single sentence seemed to land with physical weight. The judge carefully placed the MI5 letter beside her gavel. "Corporal Flint, you may remain seated. No further questions are necessary." Flint nodded once, hands returning to their neat clasp on the table. Nothing in his expression suggested victory or vindication. He had simply done what he came to do. Then something unexpected happened. A woman in the back row suddenly stood up, her hand pressed to her chest. The entire gallery turned toward her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost breaking. "He saved my mother." No one had introduced her. She hadn't been called as a witness or identified in any formal capacity, but her face, pale and clearly emotional, carried the unmistakable weight of truth. "I didn't know who he was until today," she continued, her voice steadier now. My mother never told us the details. Just that something had happened during her visit, and someone had prevented it from becoming something terrible. The judge didn't interrupt. Neither did the clerk nor anyone else in the room. Vance had gone very still in his chair, his expression unreadable. The air in the courtroom felt different now, not charged with drama, but heavy with something more substantial. Reality, perhaps, the kind that is harder to argue with than legal theories or political talking points. Flint still didn't look toward the woman. He wasn't someone who needed acknowledgement or validation. He had spoken his piece, and that was enough. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. Even the press, trained to chase noise and confrontation, seemed to understand that some moments required quiet. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was measured and formal. Given the classified nature of evidence submitted and the need for proper procedural review, I will issue a written ruling within the coming days. This hearing is now adjourned. The gavel came down softly. No dramatic crack, just a quiet tap that somehow felt final. People began to file out slowly. No one rushed for the exits or shouted questions. The whole scene felt oddly subdued, like leaving a memorial service rather than a legal proceeding. J.D. Vance remained in his seat long after everyone else had begun to move. His shoulders curved inward, staring at something on the table that probably wasn't there. His team of lawyers gathered their materials quietly, occasionally glancing at him with expressions that suggested they weren't quite sure what had just happened either. No one had declared a winner, no verdict had been announced. But everyone in that room understood that something had shifted in a way that couldn't be easily reversed. Outside the courtroom, the corridors buzzed with muted conversations, but there was none of the usual post-hearing excitement. People moved with the careful pace of those processing something unexpected. J.D. Vance emerged through a side door, his team forming a protective cluster around him. The confident stride from earlier was gone, replaced by something more mechanical. When his communications director leaned in with whispered updates about waiting interviews, Vance's responses were distracted, almost absent. "I didn't know," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone specific. "Sir," his aide prompted, "I didn't know who he was. He just looked like—" Vance trailed off, apparently realizing that finishing that sentence wouldn't improve his situation. Another advisor joined the group, flushed and speaking quickly about damage control strategies and transcript management. But even as he outlined options for spinning the story, the futility was obvious. The MI5 letter was now part of the official court record. Classified or not, the press had caught the scent. Vance stopped walking suddenly and turned to a junior staff member. "The transcript, when will it be available?" "Not immediately, sir. The judge will review it for any security redactions first, then release it for general access." "Is there any possibility of editorial discretion?" The question came out more desperate than Vance probably intended. The young man looked uncomfortable, unsure whether he was being asked for information or being pressured to influence the process. In the end, he said nothing at all. Vance resumed walking, tugging at his collar in a gesture that had become increasingly frequent since leaving the courtroom. His carefully maintained political composure was showing cracks. Meanwhile, in the main corridor, Corporal Ezra Flint moved with the same measured pace he'd maintained all day. He changed from his ceremonial uniform into a simple overcoat, but his posture remained unchanged. No hurried exit, no attempt to avoid the press that had gathered outside. When he pushed through the main doors and saw the crowd of photographers, he paused, not from hesitation, but from the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to being watched. "Corporal Flint!" a voice called out. "What's your reaction to today's proceedings? Do you expect Senator Vance to issue a public apology? Are you seeking monetary damages, or was this about something else entirely?" Flint looked out at the assembled press with the same calm expression he'd worn throughout the hearing. Not hostile, not particularly friendly, just present. "There are men who died wearing this uniform," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp autumn air. "I don't wear it lightly." That was all. No elaboration, no political commentary, no victory statements. He simply continued down the steps as if it were any other day, not pausing when the questions continued behind him. A black taxi had been waiting at the curb since early morning. The driver held the door open, not with the deference usually shown to celebrities or politicians, but with something quieter. Recognition, maybe. Or respect. As the cab pulled away from the courthouse, one voice from the crowd of reporters called out differently than the others. A younger woman, not shouting a question, but simply saying, "Thank you." Inside the Vihal, Flint reached into his coat pocket and touched the folded MI5 letter. Getting it declassified had taken years of patient navigation through bureaucratic channels, exploiting a very specific provision in the Official Secrets Act that allowed limited disclosure for civil litigation purposes. He hadn't wanted revenge against Vance personally, hadn't even been particularly interested in the money. But after years of watching people treat the ceremonial aspects of the Guard as elaborate theater, seeing men he'd served with reduced to tourist attractions, something had finally reached a breaking point. The quiet service, the classified interventions, the times when standing perfectly still had been the most important thing they could do, all of it dismissed as pageantry by someone who'd never stood a single watch. Back in the emptying courthouse, a mid-level Home Office official slowly closed his laptop. He had attended as an observer, nothing more, just routine monitoring of a case involving classified material. But as he packed his briefcase, one phrase from Flint's testimony kept echoing. "Sometimes, the most important work looks like nothing at all." That line would stay with him longer than any of the legal arguments or political posturing he'd witnessed. At the courthouse's side exit, J.D. Vance finally emerged with what remained of his entourage. The crowd of reporters was smaller now, less energetic. When they called out questions, he didn't respond. His team guided him toward a waiting car with practiced efficiency. No one booed. No one cheered. People simply watched as he got into the sedan and was driven away. And perhaps in that mundane departure, something significant had already occurred. The lawsuit hadn't concluded. No damages had been awarded, no formal vindication declared. But the narrative had shifted in a way that couldn't be easily corrected with press releases or political spin. Because some truths, once spoken aloud, change the air in ways that can't be undone. And reputations, unlike legal verdicts, don't always wait for official pronouncements before they begin to shift. The cameras that had focused on Vance's departure soon turned back toward the courthouse doors, but the man they were hoping to capture had already gone home. The real story, it seemed, had left quietly in a taxi, driven by someone who understood that some services don't require applause to matter. What would you do if the moment that defined your life was dismissed as a joke? If years of quiet service were reduced to lawn ornament humor by someone who'd never stood a single watch? Ezra Flint found his answer in a courtroom, not with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with something far more powerful. The truth spoken clearly, backed by evidence that couldn't be argued with. This wasn't about politics or wounded pride. It was about the difference between what people see and what actually happens, between ceremony and service, between performance and protection. Sometimes the most powerful response to dismissal isn't letter. Getting it declassified had taken years of patient navigation through bureaucratic channels, exploiting a very specific provision in the Official Secrets Act that allowed limited disclosure for civil litigation purposes. He hadn't wanted revenge against Vance personally, hadn't even been particularly interested in the money. But after years of watching people treat the ceremonial aspects of the Guard as elaborate theater, seeing men he'd served with reduced to tourist attractions, something had finally reached a breaking point. The quiet service, the classified interventions, the times when standing perfectly still had been the most important thing they could do. All of it dismissed as pageantry by someone who'd never stood a single watch. Back in the emptying courthouse, a mid-level home office official slowly closed his laptop. He had attended as an observer, nothing more, just routine monitoring of a case involving classified material. But as he packed his briefcase, one phrase from Flint's testimony kept echoing. Sometimes, the most important work looks like nothing at all. That line would stay with him longer than any of the legal arguments or political posturing he'd witnessed. At the courthouse's side exit, J.D. Vance finally emerged with what remained of his entourage. The crowd of reporters was smaller now, less energetic. When they called out questions, he didn't respond. His team guided him toward a waiting car with practiced efficiency. No one booed. No one cheered. People simply watched as he got into the sedan and was driven away. And perhaps in that mundane departure, something significant had already occurred. The lawsuit hadn't concluded. No damages had been awarded, no formal vindication declared. But the narrative had shifted in a way that couldn't be easily corrected with press releases or political spin. Because some truths, once spoken aloud, change the air in ways that can't be undone. And reputations, unlike legal verdicts, don't always wait for official pronouncements before they begin to shift. The cameras that had focused on Vance's departure soon turned back toward the courthouse doors. But the man they were hoping to capture had already gone home. The real story, it seemed, had left quietly in a taxi, driven by someone who understood that some services don't require applause to matter.